My name is Kate Suits. I'm an educator at the Illinois State Museum, and thank you for joining us tonight for a history of Native American policy. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Heather Bruegl, the Director of Education at the Forge Project Fellowship Program.
Hi, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Happy Native American Heritage Month. One quick housekeeping tool from my end. My dogs are currently eating right now. So if you hear that, just letting know that is what the noise is that you're hearing. My name is Heather Bruegl. I'm Director of Education for Forge Project. I am an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. I honor those tribes, and I want to also just do an acknowledgement for where I'm coming to you from. I'm coming to you from upstate New York. So I'm on Eastern time, so it's a little later here, but I'm coming from the ancestral homelands of my ancestors, the Mahikaniak, people of the waters that are never still. Today, their seat of government is located in Bowler, Wisconsin, and they are known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. I honor the ancestors on this land, past and present, by doing things like this, continuing to talk about our Indigenous history, bring awareness to issues in Indian country, and just overall do my best and be with a good mind and a good heart. I have a bachelor's and master's in U.S. history and political science. So federal Indian policy is really right up there. One of my passions, one of my favorite things to talk about. And so I hope you enjoy it as well. Again, as Kate said, if there are questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. I'm going to be mindful of time and leave plenty of time for questions. So here we go. Treaties were used to remove Native Americans from their land, and when those failed, the treaties were ultimately broken. The United States has never fully honored a treaty with a Native nation, like ever, and I think that's important to note. In the 19th century, settlers were moving into Alabama and Mississippi. They petitioned the government to remove Native Americans that were living there. Presidents Jefferson and Monroe said that the tribes could trade their lands in the East for lands in the West, but it was never really enforced. They were kind of very lackadaisical in moving Native nations. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson defeated the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and forced a treaty for them to surrender 20 million acres of land. And today this would be half of Alabama and about a fifth of Georgia. Jefferson led the way for removal with 9 of the 11 major treaties. So we're going to start with Jackson right off the bat and talk about Indian removal. So this was signed into law on May 28th, 1830 by Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time. It authorized the president to grant unsettled lands to Native Americans west of the Mississippi in exchange for lands in already existing state borders. There was a period of voluntary migration, but only a few tribes ended up moving. This included the Creeks, the Cherokee, and the Choctaws. The Choctaws were the first to sign a removal treaty, and they started to move westward, but some stayed behind. And this was actually very common. So even with removal, you would have majority of the tribe moving, but a lot of people would also stay behind. So it wasn't always set. Not everyone would continue to move. The Seminoles were coerced into signing a removal treaty, and many refused to leave, and that actually leads to the Second Seminole War. The Creeks refused to leave, but signed a treaty that would guarantee them protector rights over the land, but it did not protect them from speculators. And in 1836, the Creeks were forcibly removed from their homelands. The Chickasaws saw the move as inevitable, and they did not resist removal. So they signed a treaty with the federal government for suitable land in the West and protection until they moved. Key word there being suitable land. However, white settlers were too much for the federal government to handle to keep them out of the area until the Chickasaws ended up moving, and so the government backed out of the treaty. The Chickasaws were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their allotment. And a lot of times people do think that removal just happened in the South, but it actually happened all over. And it happened in the North as well. So in the Old Northwest, the tribes were smaller and removal process was more piecemealed. The Shawnee, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox all signed treaties to move into Indian Territory. In 1832, Black Hawk ended up leading a band of Sac and Fox back to their homelands in Illinois. And this led to the Black Hawk War. Tribes that were further east, which were the Lenape, the Kickapoo, were removed from Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. They were forced out in 1838 and resettled in Kansas. That was the Potawatomi. That was actually the Trail of Death that the Potawatomi ended up moving along. The Miami moved to Indian Territory in the 1840s, and most of the tribes then are out of the area. The Cherokee were one of what was considered one of the 5 civilized tribes. And so they, they wrote their language down, they formed schools, they educated their children in a very Eurocentric manner. They then also owned plantations and in some cases did end up owning slaves. So they considered themselves to be very Eurocentric in their lifestyle in hopes that it wouldn't actually lead to removal. But it did lead to their removal, and in 1831, the Cherokee took their case of staying on the land actually to the Supreme Court of the United States. So they took their grievance all the way to the Supreme Court. And this was a court case called Worcester v. Georgia. What they did is they used a Georgia law that white settlers couldn't live on Indian land without written permission from the state. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, stating that they have the right to self-govern themselves. So they won their case. The Supreme Court was like, absolutely, yes, you have the right to self-govern yourselves. I apologize, one of my dogs was just playing. Okay, you have the right to self-govern yourselves. You should be able to stay on your land. But the state refused to enforce the law, and Jackson refused to uphold that Supreme Court decision. So the Cherokees, after winning their Supreme Court case, did end up signing a treaty, and that was the Treaty of New Echota. Jackson had obtained the signature of Cherokee chiefs agreeing to relocation. The Cherokee were then given 2 years to voluntarily move. But by 1838, 16,000 remained on their land and refused to move. Because of that, Jackson then sent in 7,000 U.S. military troops to make the Cherokee move at gunpoint. They were not allowed to gather their belongings, and their homes were looted by white settlers as they left. This became known as the Trail of Tears. And along that way, 4,000 Native Americans died of disease, cold, and hunger. By the 1840s, with the exception of a small band of Seminoles, no tribes resided in the South from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Because of Indian removal, a total of 50,000 Native Americans were moved off their lands. And what Indian removal ended up doing, in addition to moving these Native Americans off their lands, is it opened up 25 million acres of land to white settlement and then to the spread of slavery. So after we have the Dawes Act, after we have Indian removal, it leads into the Dawes Act, which is also known as the General Allotment Act, and that is passed in 1887. Dawes Act is named for Henry Dawes. He was born in Massachusetts. He was actually born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is about 45 minutes from where I currently live. He served in the House of Representatives and later on in the Senate. While he was in the Senate, he served as chairman on the Committee of Indian Affairs. He put his focus on laws that he saw as beneficial to Indigenous people. And this was one of those laws. Dawes Act focused on breaking up reservation land into allotments for individual Native Americans. The reason behind this was that if a man was given a plot of land to take care of and farm, he would then dress in white man's clothing, and he would eventually give up his, quote, Indian ways and assimilate into a proper society, meaning a Eurocentric society. And the United States wouldn't have to act as a parent any longer. Previous to the Dawes Act, reservation land was owned by all members of the community. Land was held communally. Anyone who was registered on tribal rolls was eligible for an allotment. There were some groups that were exempt from this act at first, and that would have been the Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and the Osage, who were already in Indian Territory. It also extended to the Seneca Nation of New York and the Lakota Nation next to Nebraska. However, in 1893, this would change when the Dawes Commission negotiated with the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, and the Seminoles, now known as the 5 civilized tribes, for allotted lands in exchange for the abolishment of their tribal governments. While this act was meant to protect Native American land rights, it actually did the complete opposite. The land that was allotted was unsuitable for farming. Remember, this is land that was allotted in what is now Oklahoma. We hadn't mechanized farming yet, so the land is dry and just it's not suitable for farming. You couldn't do a lot with it. And also, many Native Americans couldn't or didn't want to take up farming because it wasn't their traditional way of life. And those who did take it up couldn't afford the tools necessary to do the job because farming is extremely expensive. It's hard to maintain. You have a lot of things that you need in order to do it. And there was also a Supreme Court case that comes out of the Dawes Act as well. And this case is called Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. Lone Wolf was a Kiowa chief that was living in Indian Territory that was created by the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867. This treaty required that 3/4 of all male Native Americans living in Indian Territory, which included at the time the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache, to agree before any changes were actually made to the territory. In 1892, Congress tried to make alterations to Indian Territory by opening up 2 million acres of reservation land to non-native settlers. Lone Wolf filed a complaint on behalf of the 3 tribes, stating that this very act violated that treaty. Again, the United States has never honored a treaty fully that it's ever had with a Native nation. The case goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it is ultimately ruled that Congress could dispose of reservation land without gaining consent set forth by the treaty. It also stated that Congress could void treaty obligations with Native Americans because Congress had inherent absolute power. The inferiority of Native Americans was put on paper with the judgment in favor of the government. 90,000 Native Americans were left landless. And the decision in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock has actually been compared to the Dred Scott decision, and a lot of times historians have referred it as our Dred Scott decision in Indian country. Later on, under the Calvin Coolidge administration, there was a study of the act, of the Dawes Act in general, and it said in 1828, the administration found that the Dawes Act had been illegally used to take lands from Native Americans. Next, we have the Citizenship Act of 1924. It's important to point out that during all of this time, from the inception of the United States to even through World War I, Native Americans are not considered citizens of the United States at all. We have no citizenship rights, none whatsoever. So we're in a unique position under the federal law. Because we're subject to the laws of the federal government, but we're not fully recognized. Citizenship was limited to those who were considered half Native American or less. So there's that introduction of blood quantum that comes into play. In 1919, after World War I, veterans received citizenship sometimes. Some women could receive citizenship if they married white men, and others received it through allotment or military service. Finally, on June 2nd, 1924, official citizenship was granted to Native Americans born within the United States. The Nationality Act of 1940 granted citizenship to all of those Native Americans born on U.S. soil. The Citizenship Act was also looked at as a way of absorbing Native Americans into mainstream culture. It's like, great, you're citizens of the United States now. You don't have to be citizens of your tribal nations, but that's just not how it works. So there were some Indigenous communities that were opposed to the idea of citizenship because they looked at it as a way of the mainstream absorbing Indigenous people, and that was not something that they were happy about. But in any way, the Citizenship Act was signed and Indigenous people were then made citizens of the United States. However, it did mean you could vote. As of 1938, there were still 7 states that refused to grant suffrage to Native Americans. It wasn't until 1948 that all states extended voting rights to Native Americans. The holdouts were Arizona and New Mexico. But I also want to point out that it wasn't then really, truly without reservations at all, the right to vote extended to Indigenous people until the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We were still subjected to those same ideas of poll tax. Our citizenship was come into question. Where you lived came into question. So it wasn't until that Citizenship Act was passed, or the Voting Rights Act was passed, that we were actually fully able to be citizens and vote in the United States of America. And just to put that into context, my grandfather was 13 years old before he became a citizen of the United States, and he was well into his 30s before he was actually able to vote fully and freely in the country that he was born in. So then we have the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, and this was passed in 1934. The act was introduced by John Collier, who was Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time. He was a sociologist, a writer, and a Native American advocate. He worked a lot in Native causes and tried to bring awareness to Native issues. He grew up in Atlanta, and he was educated at Columbia. He spent a year living in Taos, New Mexico, and learning about the Pueblos. In 1923, he formed the American Indian Defense Association. And in 1933, he was then named Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The act, the IRA, obviously is introduced during the Great Depression. It's also considered the Indian New Deal. And this act was an attempt to undo some of the harm caused by the Dawes Act. This ended, the first thing it did is it ended the policy of allotment and banned the future sale of Native American land, meaning now that any Native Americans' land that hadn't been allotted couldn't be sold to non-Native people. It reverted back to the tribe. But land that had already been sold to non-Native people, it was gone. You didn't have it anymore. The only way you could get it back is if that land went up for sale and then your tribal nation bought it. So reservations now are in this weird checkerboard pattern. I think one of the best examples to point out is actually the Oneida Reservation in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It encompasses part of the city of Green Bay, but the reservation itself is very checkerboarded, very allotted. And you can see that when you look at the maps of it. The IRA also meant that the government could purchase the fee land and return it to tribal status. So fee land is land that you pay taxes on. Trust land, which is reservation land, is land that you do not pay taxes on. More than 2 million acres of land returned to various tribes, and it granted Native American communities some measure of governmental and judicial autonomy if they were modeled in the same style of the United States. I think here it's really important to point out that the United States did in fact actually model our form of government off of the Haudenosaunee form of government, which is the Great Law of Peace. The Iroquois Confederacy, if you're not familiar with the term Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, and that was the Iroquois Confederacy or Six Nations, whatever you're more familiar with. So the government now is saying you can have your tribal governments if you model it after our tribal government, whereas the federal government actually did model it after an indigenous form of government. But allotment had taken a heavy toll on many tribes, and a lot of traditions and customs were lost. Traditional Native Americans questioned the act and saw it as another way to live in white institutions. And there were also mixed reactions to the IRA. Some praised Collier while others criticized him. Anthropologists have criticized Collier for not recognizing the diversity in Native lifestyles. And I think this is in relation to his year living among the Pueblo in Taos, New Mexico. I would go off assuming that he saw all Native nations the same way, but we're not. Like Southwest tribes are very different than the tribes here in the Northeast, who are very different than the tribes in the Midwest, who are very different from the tribes in the Southeast, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people criticized him for not recognizing that Native nations are actually very diverse nations. This Indian Reorganization Act ultimately leads to termination. So in 1943, there was a survey of living conditions on Native American reservations that was conducted, and the conditions were found to be awful. There was severe poverty. It was decided that Native Americans needed to be moved into mainstream culture, so a policy of termination was adopted, because let's take them out of the lifestyle that they know and throw them into something that they don't know and aren't familiar with, and they'll be successful. Clearly, that did not work out. In 1953, the federal government officially adopted a policy of termination, meaning that they declared that they wanted to, as quickly as possible, make every Native American within the territorial United States subject to the same laws, privileges, and responsibilities. This also severed treaty responsibilities and obligations on the side of the federal government. So from 1953 to 1964, 109 tribes were terminated with responsibility and jurisdiction handed over to the states. 2.5 million acres of land were taken, and thousands of Native Americans lost their tribal status. Land was sold to non-Native people again, and official recognition of tribes was no longer recognized by the federal government. Federal services and protections were taken away, and reservations basically vanished overnight. Much of the termination policy that was designed to help tribes actually backfired. The Menominee Nation of Wisconsin, which was the first tribe to be terminated, their education was effective. They experienced a 75% high school dropout rate. Indian health services were unable to provide health care because many of them were deemed ineligible. And there was an increase in taxes and high unemployment rate that moved Native Americans who were already in a low poverty status into an even low poverty status. Why is this? Because you're now having to pay taxes on land that you didn't have to pay taxes before. So it's an extra income, or it's an extra bill you're not used to. The income might not be there. You have to travel farther to work. So there are a lot of things going into play here. Many of the tribes that were first terminated were tribes that were actually successful in their tribal governments and those who lived on the most resourceful land. And when I looked into termination even more, the senators who introduced termination policy were from states that had very high Indigenous populations. So, and just to put this into perspective, the reservation land in the United States only makes up 2% of the land population in the United States, but we sit on trillions of dollars worth of natural resources. So with reservations gone, this opens that up to be able to get to those natural resources. Many tribes tried to fight termination, but with limited funds and poor conditions, many couldn't. In the midst of termination, you have the Indian Relocation Act that's passed. And so this law was intended to encourage Native Americans throughout the United States to leave reservations and acquire skills and assimilate them into a mainstream society. This was part of termination policy of the era. And at the time, what the policy that was happening, the federal government was cutting subsidies to reservations in hopes of actually getting rid of the reservation system. The act didn't technically force people to leave reservations, but it made it significantly harder for them to stay. Benefits of this policy included some paid moving expenses and vocational training, provide funds to buy tools needed for vocational training, a per diem for both the time it took to relocate and for 4 weeks after that relocation, grants to purchase work clothing, household goods, tuition costs, and in some cases, a grant to purchase a home. In 1947, Julius Krug, who was Secretary of the Interior at the time, under Truman, suggested a 10-year program for the Navajo and the Hopi to provide vocational training. This program became law in 1950 under the Navajo-Hopi law, and the program was funded and helped move people to Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, and Denver. And you can see an example of the flyer here on the screen. In 1950, 6% of Native Americans lived in urban areas. In 1951, the BIA began extending the program to tribes living in Oklahoma, New Mexico, California, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. The following year, the program was then extended to all Native Americans. And by 1955, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, had relocation offices in Cleveland, Dallas, Minneapolis, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, and other large cities. Having the relocation offices in larger cities with where more jobs were available was to reduce the poverty of Native Americans. By 1954, approximately 6,400 Native Americans were living in urban areas. By 1960, more than 31,000 moved to the cities from reservations. And between 1950 and 1980, more than 750,000 Native Americans moved to the cities either through the relocation program or on their own. In the year 2000, the urban Native population was 64% higher than that of pre-termination. But not everything worked out when you moved to the city. The program did have some long-lasting effects. Those who relocated oftentimes felt isolated from their communities. There was a loss of traditional culture. They faced racial discrimination and segregation, job discrimination, and fewer opportunities to advance. Many times you could only find low-paying jobs in areas that lived in had higher expenses than most were used to, so there was still a high rate of poverty, and you also faced unemployment. Lower income housing that they were able to find was in many times in areas that was targeted for urban renewal, and many times replaced with office buildings, freeways, and commercial developments. The concept of redlining, which is the systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices, made it all but impossible to live near where you worked, and children of relocated workers oftentimes had a hard time getting enrolled in segregated schools. But what did end up happening, the positive that came out of Indian relocation, was that those who relocated to urban areas started to form pan-Indian communities. They started to work together to organize for common things such as self-determination, civil rights, and sovereignty. And in 1968, the American Indian movement was formed to help with issues of the urban Indian. We then have the American Civil Rights Act, passed in 1968. Prior to the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court made it clear that tribal internal affairs concerning tribal members' rights were not covered by the Fifth Amendment, which is double jeopardy and self-incrimination. But in the same breath, tribes were subjected to the power of Congress and the Constitution. So these rights didn't apply to us, but at the same time, we had to follow the laws that Congress put forth and the laws in the Constitution. Just like any other government, even your 8th grade government, there was corruption within tribal governments as well. And sometimes you didn't receive the full benefits of the Bill of Rights. With the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, tribal members now have full access to all of the rights in the Bill of Rights, which is those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Tribal courts have to afford due process and enforce other civil liberties. There are some differences, though, between the Bill of Rights and the Indian Civil Rights Act. One is, while it guarantees freedom of religion, it does not stop a tribe from establishing a religion, and understands that many tribes do not separate religion from government in other areas of life. So that means, starting maybe your government council meetings with ceremony or prayer, they understand that. It also guarantees a criminal defendant the right an attorney at the defendant's expense, but a tribe does not have to provide an attorney if the defendant cannot afford one. And there is no right to a jury trial in civil cases under the Indian Civil Rights Act. So there are some differences. And finally, I wanted to talk to you about Self-Determination and Education Act, which was introduced in 1975. So this policy was first introduced under Nixon, and it was signed by Gerald Ford on January 4th, 1975, because Nixon was no longer in office for some obvious reasons. The act officially ended the policy of termination. So that policy we talked about earlier, where tribes were losing federal recognition status, treaty rights were being severed, so on and so forth, this officially ends it. And it stops that policy right away. Some tribes had been restored prior to that For example, the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin was restored in 1974. They have their own act, the Menominee Restoration Act of 1974. So some were restored beforehand, some were restored when termination was officially ended in 1975. The act also allowed the federal government to contract with tribal governments again for federal services. The Bureau of Indian Affairs at first was resistant to the act and wanted to retain control over tribal affairs and how money was spent. Over time, and with increased pressure from the tribes, the BIA slowly started to lessen its hold over tribal affairs, and the tribes were able to apply for and receive grants for funding again. The act also gave control of Native American schools back over to the tribes, where language and culture was reintroduced into the curriculum. Self-determination gave Native Americans the opportunity to gain some control over their tribal governments, including economic development and natural resource rights, which are really important. In many ways, self-determination helped many tribes gain back tribal government, which had led to the implementation of tribal courts and new economic development, which leads to a new economic way of life for tribes and a way for them to be self-sustaining in some of the practices. So it kind of leads to the beginning of gaming, but also starting businesses and enterprises in order to support the tribe itself. So there are a few suggested readings and documentaries that I love to tell people about, where you can learn more information. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a reading that I recommend that you have in your library, right alongside A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Both books are absolutely amazing. Roxanne's book is very good. I've read it several times. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown is an all-time bestseller. It hasn't ever been out of print since it was released in the 1970s. So I recommend that one as well. I didn't put it on here, but I also recommend, after you're done reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, I recommend you read The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer, who is an Ojibwe. And Dee Brown's book ends in 1890 with the Wounded Knee Massacre, and it's kind of like, there, it's done, it's over with. But it's not done, it's not over with. Dee Brown kind of leaves the ending in 1890, where in The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer says, yeah, while some things might have ended in 1890, obviously, Native American culture and tradition didn't end. We're still resilient, we're still here. And he goes through a really great history of that. So I recommend that you do read that as well. Websites that you may want to visit to learn more. The National Archives over the past couple years officially announced last year, I believe it was, the digitization of over 360 some odd treaties written between the United States and Native nations. These are now online. You have access to them and you can read them, and I encourage you to read them. The reading treaties, you can learn a lot. You can absolutely learn a lot, and so you have access to them right on your computer, right on your laptop here. The Library of Congress is also a great source to use, a great site to use. Their website's pretty user-friendly, and you can learn more about the various policies that we've talked about today. 100 Years is a documentary that talks about the mismanagement of funds that Eloise Colball found out about. She served as the treasurer for the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, and she discovered that the government was mismanaging, the federal government was mismanaging funds that were to be paid to Indigenous people who were leasing their land to companies who were doing like natural resource work. So there is a thing in place where you can lease your land, the government pays you, but the government wasn't doing that. And so just as President Obama was coming into office, the case was finally winding down. It was like a case that was filed like in the 90s, early 2000s, to sue for this money that hadn't been paid, and billions of dollars were paid out to people who had not been paid properly. Great documentary. You can get it on Netflix. Trudell, you can also get on Netflix, Amazon. I think I even saw it on Hulu. Is about the Lakota writer, author, poet, artist John Trudell, who was at the occupation of Alcatraz, and it goes through his life, his story, and it is absolutely amazing. I've watched it several times. I'm a big fan of John Trudell and his work, and so I encourage you to watch that as well. And then The West is a documentary by Ken Burns. Ken Burns is probably one of my favorite documentary makers. And what I like about The West is obviously he talks about westward expansion and all the things, taming the West and all of that. But what I like about it is he doesn't exclude the Indigenous history, including the bad parts. He talks about all of it. And so I think that is really cool. And it's told in a very inclusive way. So those are the documentaries and readings that I would suggest to you. So with that, I just want to thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your evening to spend with me. That actually went a lot faster than I anticipated. I don't know if I was just talking fast or what, but we have plenty of time for Q&A. And I know Kate had said you could put your questions in the chat, so I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. Please, ask whatever. Don't be afraid to ask anything. I'm an educator at heart, and I want people to ask questions, and so I don't judge the questions that are being asked. So please feel free to ask anything, and thank you guys so much.
And then anyone who has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A box. We have one.
Oh, perfect.
I understand some Cherokee stayed in the East, hiding in the mountains. What do you know?
Well, what I do know is that there is Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and then there's the Eastern Cherokee in North Carolina, which are both federally recognized nations. So that is easy to lead to believe that, some always did stay behind. And that's true with anything. There's an Oneida Nation in New York here, but there's also Oneida Nation in Wisconsin as well, and in Canada. So they all kind of vary. And again, like I said, with removal, not everybody moved. So the fact that there are Cherokee who stayed behind, absolutely, that's totally, that falls in line with history as we know it. No one has any other questions?
I guess not. Kind of a quiet group this evening.
Yeah. I mean, that's okay. Maybe I'm just going to take that as I was very thorough.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Well, then I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's program. We hope to see you at future museum programs and events. And you can check the museum's website to see all our upcoming events. And I will post a link in the chat. We hope you'll consider a gift to help the Illinois State Museum continue to share stories, start conversations, and provide opportunities for learning and growth. I will include a link in the chat as well. And I want to thank Heather again for taking the time to chat with us this evening.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone taking a little time out of their evening to maybe learn a little bit of something that you didn't know beforehand. And it is Native American Heritage Month, so I hope you are out there reading and watching and absorbing as much as you can. So thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.